Trains, a dominant form of transport and one I'm more than a bit familiar with. When it comes to 8-bit home computers though, I am relieved that none of my train experiences are quite like those in Stop the Express. Originally developed by Fumiko Itagaki for Hudson Soft and debuting in 1983 on the Sharp X1, it will jump over to the MSX family before heading over to Europe, leading to 2 more conversions. One for the C64, published by Commodore, alongside one for the ZX Spectrum, published by Sinclair. Your mission here is straightforward. The ITA Express has been overtaken by the dreaded Redman, and you must board it, fight your way to the engine, and bring it to a stop. It's quite the straightforward assignment. Mostly. You'll be dropped onto the rear carriage and have to fight your way to the front. Each level is split in 2 paths, and firstly, you'll be fighting on top of the carriages. On the way, you'll be pursued by those Redmen agents, popping out of carriages behind you, to throw knives in your general direction. They're relentless, but a quick jump kick to the face, or plucking out a hapless snake bird from the sky and launching it in pursuit, will dispatch them quickly enough. Barriers will become another threat as you move onwards. You could safely walk under them, but timing is crucial when moving between carriages, as leaping into them will be fatal. Once you get to the middle of the train, however, you'll now duck inside and the second half of the level takes place there. The Redmen now attack you head on, and your jump kick is your only defense here. Or you can just simply leap over them. Creatures will patrol the upper area of each carriage. Whilst you could use the hand grips there to stay in the air a bit longer, they are enough of a threat that timing your jumps is ever so important to make it through without dying. Once you have made it towards that front carriage at last, there's one obstacle left: obtaining the key to the cab. This just happens to be guarded by one final critter bouncing around haphazardly. Once you pick the key up, time to enter the cab and hit the brakes, bringing the train to a stop and getting a lot of bonus points in the process. Most importantly though, it's time to go back to the rear of the train and do it all again. Each loop gets harder with more Redmen in pursuit, and so unsurprisingly, what is a bit of a tough game to begin with gets even harder on those successive runs. That is what you call old school gaming. Now for our 3 home computer versions, all of them respond very well. They feel great, and it's generally a good challenge. It does need to be said that the MSX version does run a bit faster than the C64 or Spectrum versions. And when starting out, I did find that to make it a little harder to get into the rhythm of moving through the game as a result. Stop the Express's visuals are indicative of its early 80s arcade style heritage, with stark black backgrounds and bright colours throughout. The Sharp X1 didn't have the sprite hardware that other home computers offered, so it's no surprise to see them unused on both the C64 and MSX versions. It also means that the C64 version doesn't have any smooth scrolling in the scene. Neither of these truly affect the game, with the pacing resulting in the movement and scrolling not really feeling that choppy at all. Colours on both the MSX and Spectrum are vibrant, allowing characters and objects to stand out vividly against the backgrounds. The colour choices don't quite work as well on the C64, as the palette feels a little washed out. Regardless though, the visuals are clear, and you're not going to miss projectiles or enemies against the scenery. Unsurprisingly, like many early releases, the audio in Stop the Express certainly isn't fully featured. It primarily consists of sound effects and the occasional little ditty over fully looping in-game music. The sound of the train rumbling down the tracks is incredibly atmospheric, especially on the MSX, though the rendition on the C64 SID is pretty solid as well. The same can kind of be said for the sounds of the helicopter dropping you on the train. great on MSX, though a little less so on the SID. The rest of the effects aren't as detailed as either of those, mostly consisting of bleeps and bloops, but it really gives that early arcade vibe quite impressively. As for the Spectrum you're asking, its audio capabilities are far lower than the C64 or MSX, and so the train and helicopter audio is seriously lacking in comparison. But the rest of the sound effects compare very well against those other two micros. All three versions support keyboard or joystick controls. On the MSX, this thankfully maps to the system's cursor keys, alongside using space to drop a snakebird. Things get a little more challenging on the C64 and Spectrum fronts, with a somewhat more complicated set of controls for the keyboard. Instead of just using keys mapped to left, right, up, down, and fire, as the MSX does, you'll have to deal with controls to jump up, jump left, or jump right, alongside being able to lay down and face left and right there as well. While 64 owners can just hook up their preferred joystick of choice, Spectrum owners are a bit more limited in what they can do. If, like me, you're running an older Spectrum model, you have to have a Sinclair Interface 2 in order to have joystick support. Of course, the newer Spectrum models include these ports, so providing you have a joystick with that grey lead that's compatible, you're all set to go. For the MSX and C64 versions, I had no problems at all with the joystick support. The controls are incredibly responsive, and I never really found myself struggling to fight them to get used to the timing the game needs as you move through. I wish I could say the same for playing the Spectrum version on the keyboard. Those keyboard controls are infuriating. I put quite a lot of time into trying to learn the controls, fumbling about, missing jumps all in the process, and was just about ready to write the Spectrum version off entirely when I noticed one thing in the tape inlay. The Interface 2 maps its joystick inputs to keys. The layout can certainly be considered awkward, but at least it means you're dealing with 4 directions and a fire button instead of that overcomplicated mess of keys it suggests. When I started playing and getting used to that layout, they worked pretty well. Not quite as well as a joystick, which is kind of meant to be expected, but more than solid enough that let me have quite a few decent runs on the board playing the Spectrum edition. Stop the Express is one charming early arcade-style challenge. Whilst its main loop can be considered quite short, especially in comparison to many of its peers from the era, what is on offer here is a well-done slice of engaging action. With many early games, the quality in their conversions can vary wildly. So, it's a surprise that all three here are very much on par with each other. I was genuinely surprised noticing this as I was playing all three, but on further digging about, learning that Mr. Itagaki had done every conversion, I was no longer surprised. Seeing the author actually handling these always results in better versions than if some random team had done it instead. Now, the MSX version has definitely got a speed advantage here, and from my experience, it certainly made it a little more frantic to play and a touch harder to get into as a result. If you try Stop the Express out for the first time, you might not want to start here, just until you get used to it. Of the three, the C64 is probably the slowest. That's not a bad thing though. I found the pacing there to be that bit more playable as a result because it was easier to get into the rhythm of the action and was way more engaging for me. The other difference it offers is a slightly wider view of the play area. It doesn't feel like much, but it contributes to being a little more situationally aware, helping out with easing the challenge that little bit more. Depending on which Spectrum model you're playing on, and your patience with being forced to deal with the keyboard controls, that version can potentially be a hard sell. Which is a shame, because overall, it's quite a solid conversion in how it plays, and in terms of its pacing, just that little bit ahead of the C64 in terms of speed. You truly cannot go wrong with any of these three versions of the game, and whilst I'm always going to have that nostalgia for the C64 version. Either way, you're going to certainly be on track for some express stopping action, no matter which platform you're getting off at. And to leave it there, thank you all very much for watching.